wind reading came back wrong. Sergeant First Class Dana Mercer said so out loud, from the spotting scope and on, in the flat tone of someone delivering information rather than an opinion. Wind is shifting, gusting 12 to 17 from the northwest. Thermals off the ridge. This shot is not viable. Nobody disagreed with her. The target was at 3,800 meters, nearly 4 kilometers of mountain air between the muzzle and the mark, across an elevation change of 600 meters, in conditions that the range assessment computer had already flagged as outside standard operational parameters. The Barrett M107A1 was on the bipod. The data had been run 3 times. Every number pointed to the same conclusion. The conclusion was, this shot does not get made today. Lieutenant Commander Brett Hollis stood 6 feet behind the firing position, with his arms crossed and his eyes on the ridge and the particular expression of a man who has been told something he does not want to accept. 12 SEAL snipers, his team, 4 years together, the best long-range precision unit his command had fielded in a decade, were arranged behind him in a loose arc. They had all run the numbers. They had all arrived at Dana's conclusion independently. Every one of them had said some version of the same thing in the past 20 minutes. Nobody had attempted the shot. Hollis turned and looked at the woman standing at the rear of the group. She was not part of his team. She was not part of his command. She was attached, temporarily, on paper, for the duration of a joint assessment exercise that was now in its 3rd day. From a unit whose designation he had been given, but whose operational record he had not been provided, which had bothered him from the moment she arrived and had bothered him more with every hour since. She was small, 5'4", maybe 125 pounds in the field jacket, standing slightly apart from his men with her hands loose at her sides and her eyes on the ridge. She had said almost nothing in 3 days. She had observed. She had taken notes on a small weathered pad that she kept in her left breast pocket. She had asked 2 questions. One on the first day about the team's standard wind-hold protocol, one on the second about the specific ammunition batch being used. And both questions had been so precisely targeted that 2 of his senior snipers had spent that evening quietly discussing what they implied about the person who had asked them. He had not asked her background. She had not offered it. He had called her a liability in the debrief on day 2, not to her face, to his executive officer, in a conversation he had considered private. He had said, "She is a liability on this exercise, dead weight. Whatever her unit thought they were sending us, this is not the asset the assessment requires." His XO had said nothing in response, which Hollis had interpreted as agreement and which had in fact been something else entirely. She had a scar that ran along the left side of her neck, thin, pale, old. The specific track a supersonic fragment leaves when it passes close enough to mark the skin without doing the damage it was capable of doing. Hollis had noticed it on day 1. He had not thought about what it implied. He was looking at her now. "Captain," he said. He did not know her name. He had been given it and had not retained it, which was a choice he had made without quite deciding to. "Your assessment." She looked at the ridge for a moment before she answered. Then she said, "The shot is viable." The 12 snipers behind Hollis went very still. Hollis looked at her. He looked at the ridge. He looked back at her. The computer flagged it outside parameters. My entire team ran the data. "I know," she said. "I watched them run it. And your assessment is that the shot is viable." "Yes." He waited for her to qualify it, to add conditions, to walk it back slightly in the way that people walk back a position when a room pushes against it. She did not. She looked at the ridge with the same eyes she had brought to every moment of the past 3 days, dark, quiet, reading something in the distance that the rest of the room was not quite seeing. "Then take it," Hollis said. He said it the way a person extends an invitation they are confident will be declined. She looked at him for one beat. Then she moved to the firing position. Before we go any further, if this story already has you holding your breath, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very last word. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Her name was Captain Riva Lane, and she had been shooting at distance since she was 9 years old. She grew up in a high desert town in New Mexico, 40 miles from the nearest city, in a place where the light came in at angles that made everything look farther away than it was, and where learning to account for the difference between apparent distance and actual distance was simply a condition of existing in the landscape. Her grandfather, a man named Daniel Lane, who had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a reconnaissance Marine and had come home quiet and stayed quiet, had handed her a rifle on her 9th birthday with no ceremony and said, "The wind is always lying to you. Your job is to figure out what the truth is underneath the lie." He had not elaborated. She had spent the next 29 years elaborating for herself. She had a natural aptitude for ballistic calculation that her first range instructor, a retired Army Ranger named Fowles, had described in her assessment as unprecedented in his experience, which was a statement he had never made about any other candidate in 11 years of instruction and which he had written in her file and underlined. She had not known about the underline until years later. When she found out, she had not reacted to it, because by then the assessment was simply a description of something she had already known about herself for a long time. Not with pride, but with the same factual acceptance she brought to any other aspect of her physical reality. She was left-handed. She had a high tolerance for cold. She could calculate ballistic compensation for a moving target at distance with a speed and accuracy that the standard training models did not have an adequate framework for measuring. These were simply facts about her, like her height and her eye color, and she did not perform them for rooms. She had enlisted at 20. She had been assessed for Special Operations Sniper qualification at 24, which required her to complete a selection process that had a 17% completion rate across all candidates, and which she had completed. And she had done so with an assessed long-range precision score that her evaluating officer had reviewed 3 times before submitting because he wanted to be certain the numbers were correctly recorded and not the product of a data entry error. They were correctly recorded. Her mentor through the early years of her career was a master sergeant named Carla Webb, the first female sniper instructor in the program's history. A woman who had spent 12 years making the system accommodate something it had not been designed for, and who had arrived at the other side of that process with a complete and functional immunity to other people's surprise. Webb had watched Riva shoot for the first time during qualification, and had said afterward, in the specific, undramatic tone she used for everything, "You have a gift. Gifts are liabilities if you don't work them harder than your weaknesses. Go work it." Riva had gone and worked it. Webb had been killed in 2020 on a training exercise in conditions that should not have been fatal and were one of those events the after-action reports describe as a confluence of factors, which is the language used when the alternative is naming the specific human failures that compounded into catastrophe. Riva had been 4,000 miles away when it happened and had found out by encrypted message at 0415 hours and had sat with it in the dark for 20 minutes before getting up and going to work. She thought about Webb every time she lay down behind a rifle. In the 15 years between her enlistment and the 3rd day of the joint assessment exercise in the mountains, Riva Lane had completed 8 overseas deployments. She had made confirmed precision engagements at distances that remain, several of them classified. She had been the lead sniper on 2 joint special operations missions whose outcomes altered the operational landscape of an entire theater. She had been wounded once, the fragment that left the scar along her neck, in a hide site in a country she is not at liberty to name, which had passed close enough to mark her and continued past, which she had later described to her unit's medical officer as the most educational near miss of her professional life, for reasons she did not elaborate on. She had a confirmed long-range engagement record that placed her, by every metric the program used, in the top 0.5% of precision shooters in active Special Operations Service. She had been attached to Hollis's unit for 3 days, and he had called her a liability, and she knew he had called her that, and it had not changed anything she did or planned to do, because she had been in enough rooms that did not know what she was to have stopped letting the rooms set her pace. The reason she was here, the specific operational reason the joint assessment had brought her to this mountain on this day, was this. There was a target. Not a real target. A ceramic plate, 30 centimeters wide, mounted on a post at 3,800 meters in a canyon on the far side of the ridge, placed there by the assessment coordinators to represent an operational scenario that Hollis's unit had been unable to solve in its last 2 field exercises. The scenario was a high-value target protected by terrain at a distance outside reliable engagement parameters for a standard team. The question the assessment was designed to answer was, does this unit have a solution? Hollis's unit had run the numbers. The numbers said no. The numbers were not wrong. They were simply incomplete, because they had been run by people using the standard protocols, and the standard protocols had been built around the standard human capacity for this kind of work. And Reva Lane was not operating within the standard human capacity for this kind of work. She lay down behind the Barrett. She did not ask for a spotter. She had her own data. She had been building it since she arrived on the mountain, not on the pad, not formally, but in the specific, continuous, unconscious accumulation of a mind that is always reading the environment it is inside. She had the wind pattern, not the numbers the instruments were giving. Those were accurate as far as they went. She had the shape of it, the rhythm of it, the way it moved across the ridge in cycles that the instruments measured at the peak and missed in the valley between cycles. Her grandfather had told her, when she was 9 and could not yet have understood it fully, the instruments tell you what the wind did. Your job is to know what it is about to do. She had understood it fully by the time she was 12. She settled behind the scope. 3,800 meters, elevation change of 600 meters, downward, which meant the bullet would be in flight for a duration that allowed the wind to act on it across multiple cycle shifts. The standard protocol addressed the initial wind reading and the terminal wind at the target. It did not adequately model what happened in the middle. She modeled the middle. She did it in the same part of her mind she used for everything else, in the time it took to settle her breathing, without writing it down, without a calculator, without asking anyone for input. The wind was gusting 12 to 17. The cycle was running approximately 9 seconds between peak gusts. She needed the shot to break in the 2-second window at the bottom of the cycle, which meant she needed to press the trigger 7 seconds before that window opened, accounting for the bullet's flight time, which at this distance and this elevation change, with this ammunition and this temperature, was approximately 4.3 seconds. She had 2 seconds of window. She needed to use the first half of it. She would know when the window was coming by the behavior of the grass on the near ridge, which bent differently at the bottom of the cycle than the instruments could detect, and which she had been watching for 40 minutes. She breathed out. She watched the grass. Behind her, 12 SEAL snipers stood in a loose arc and said nothing. Hollis stood slightly apart from them, arms still crossed, watching her behind the scope with the expression of a man who has committed to a position and is no longer entirely certain it was the correct one. Dana Mercer, the spotter who had called the shot non-viable 12 minutes ago, was at her own scope. She was watching the target area. She had said nothing since Riva lay down. She was watching the way a person watches when they have become uncertain of their own conclusion and are waiting to find out what the correct one is. 7 seconds, 4 seconds. The grass on the near ridge changed. Not much. The specific, subtle change of the cycle dropping toward its floor. A degree of bend, a slight irregularity in the pattern that the instruments would have missed and that she had been waiting for. She pressed the trigger. The Barrett cracked. The sound went out across the canyon and came back from the far ridge as almost nothing, absorbed by the distance, diminished by the elevation, reduced to a flat, faint echo that arrived 2 seconds after the shot and meant very little by itself. There was a silence. The silence lasted 4.3 seconds. Then, from the canyon, at 3,800 meters, the ceramic plate rang. Not loudly, not dramatically. The small, clean, bright sound of a precision impact on a hard surface carried back across the canyon on the wind. Thin, clear, unmistakable. Dana Mercer pulled back from her scope. She looked at the target post through the scope again. She looked at the data on her board. She pulled back from the scope a second time and looked at the sky with the expression of a person processing a significant piece of new information. "Impact confirmed," she said. Her voice was careful. "Center plate." Nobody spoke. Riva did not move from the firing position immediately. She stayed behind the scope for a moment, not celebrating, not looking at the team, just looking at the target area with the same quiet attention she had brought to every other moment of the past 3 days. Then she rose from the bipod. She brushed the dust from her jacket. She stepped back from the Barrett. She looked at nothing in particular, which was what she always looked at when she was waiting for a room to complete a thought she had given it time to finish on its own. Hollis had not moved. His arms were no longer crossed. They were at his sides. He was looking at Dana Mercer's spotting board, at the wind data, the elevation data, the range confirmation, the impact notation, with the expression of a man reconstructing something he thought he understood and finding the reconstruction does not match the original. He looked at Riva. She looked back at him. One of his snipers, Senior Chief Petty Officer Wren, 14 years in, the steadiest shooter on the team, walked to the firing position and crouched down and looked through the Barrett's scope at 3,800 meters. He stayed there for a long moment. He stood back up. He looked at the wind data on the board. He looked at the grass on the near ridge. He looked at Riva. He said, "What cycle timing did you use?" It was not quite a question. It was the response of a man who has identified the variable he did not know about and wants to confirm he has found it. 9-second cycle, she said. Shot at the 7-second mark. Wren looked at the grass. He looked at the instruments. He said quietly to himself and to nobody in particular, "The instruments don't show the cycle floor." "No," she said, "they don't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been reading that pattern?" "Since I arrived on the mountain." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "What is your confirmed long-range record?" Not a challenge. A real question, asked in the register of someone who has recalibrated their framework and is now genuinely trying to understand the dimensions of what they are looking at. She told him the distance. She said it the way she said everything, without inflection, without performance, as simply a fact about herself that the question had made relevant. Wren turned and looked at Hollis. Hollis was already looking at Wren. Their eyes met. Something passed between them that did not require words. The specific, wordless communication of two senior operators who have simultaneously arrived at a conclusion they would both have rejected 48 hours ago. Hollis looked at Riva. He looked at the canyon. He looked at the Barrett on the bipod and the spotting data on Mercer's board and the ceramic plate at 3,800 meters that had been ringing in the canyon for the past 90 seconds. He said, "Walk me through the cycle calculation." Not an apology, not an acknowledgement. Hollis was not a man built for formal acknowledgement, but it was the question he would only have asked of someone he intended to listen to, and both of them knew it. And that was enough. She walked him through it. She stood in the cold mountain air and explained the cycle, the grass, the gap between what the instruments measured and what the wind was actually doing, in the clear and specific language of someone who has been doing this long enough that the explanation is the simple part. Hollis listened without interrupting. Wren listened. The 12 snipers who had stood in silence since the crack of the Barrett listened with the focused attention of professionals being given information that is going to change how they work. Dana Mercer took notes. Hollis's after-action report, submitted 4 days later to the Joint Assessment Command, contained a section on long-range engagement in variable wind conditions that cited a new wind cycle reading methodology observed during the exercise. It did not name the source. The Assessment Command, reviewing the report, noted the methodology and flagged it for wider distribution to precision sniper units across 2 commands. The flag went to Riva's unit first. Her commanding officer read it, looked at the distribution list, looked at the exercise dates, and sent her a one-line message that said, "Understood you were useful." She read it and went back to work. Senior Chief Petty Officer Wren put in a formal request to the Joint Assessment Program for a methodology exchange session with Riva's unit. The request was approved. The session lasted 2 days. Wren said afterward, to anyone in his unit who asked, that it was the most significant 2 days of professional development in his career. He did not qualify the statement. He meant it without qualification. Hollis submitted no separate comment on the exercise. He did not need to. His report spoke for itself, and anyone reading the report who knew what to look for would find in it the specific shape of a man who has encountered something he did not expect and has done the honest work of updating his understanding. That shape was enough. It was, in some ways, the most that could be asked of him, and he had delivered it. Riva Lane flew back to her unit on a transport that left the mountain airstrip at 0600 the morning after the exercise concluded. She slept on the flight. She was at her desk by early afternoon. She drank black coffee. She reviewed the week's operational briefings and filed her own exercise assessment report, which was precise and thorough and mentioned no individual by name and made no reference to the shot beyond its technical parameters, because the technical parameters were the relevant part and the rest was the room's business, not hers. She did not think about the canyon. At 1700, she went to the range. She shot for an hour in conditions that were calm and without drama. The routine maintenance of a capability she had been building since she was 9 years old in a desert where the light made everything look farther away than it was. She shot steadily and well, and packed up her equipment and went home. She had done what she came to do. The canyon had confirmed what she already knew. That was all a canyon ever does. There is a particular kind of expertise that does not seek the room's permission before it operates. It does not wait to be recognized. It does not calibrate its performance to the audience's expectations or adjust its effort to match what the room believes is possible. It simply works. In the cold and the wind and the insufficient light. At the level it has always worked, and it lets the results be the conversation. Rooms called her a liability. The wind over the canyon called her something else. The ceramic plate at 3,800 meters called her something else. The data on Dana Mercer's board called her something else. The most honest assessments do not come from the people who are watching. They come from the physics. And the physics, on a cold mountain in the 3rd week of November, with a 12 to 17 knot gust across a 600-meter elevation drop, had rendered its verdict at the 4.3-second mark with a sound like a bell struck cleanly in an empty church. Some people need a room full of witnesses to know what they are worth. And some people knew what they were worth so long ago that the witnesses are simply the world finally doing the arithmetic they finished years before anyone else picked up the pencil.